Great. Okay, so welcome everyone. We are here interviewing guest composer Robert Kier. He is a composer who works a lot in the symphonic and concerto domain. He's composed over 12 symphonies and many concertos, including 3 violin concertos, one of which we listened to for this interview. He teaches at the University of Oregon and runs the Oregon Bach Festival, which is quite a prominent festival, and I've known a few people that have gone there. One of the interesting things I saw from his bio is that he considers himself a 21st century composer, and his primary influences come from outside the century of his birth. Welcome, Professor Kier.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.
My name is Logan Barrett. I'm a second-year master's student here. I've just committed to doing a PhD, and I am a TA in the ears department. I'm here with 3 other students, Yuanning, Bonnie, and Pewen. I think we should all introduce ourselves briefly first. So let's go Yuanning, Pewen, then Bonnie.
Hi, Professor Kier. It's been an honor to have this interview with you. My name is Yuanning, and I'm currently a junior composer and pianist.
Good to meet you.
Hi, Professor. I am Pewen. I'm in the first year undergrad and composing pianist.
Great to meet you.
Hi, Professor, and I'm Bonnie. I'm the senior student at Eastman, and I'm going to go to the University of Michigan for my master. Yes.
Great. Great to meet you.
Cool. So we've fielded questions from all of the students, and we've compiled them and put them into different topics, and we're each going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes asking you questions based on similar themes. So we're going to, I believe, start with Bonnie.
Hi, Professor. So I have a few general questions for you. So the first is I really like the piece Joanna of the World. It's really beautiful and quite poetic. So the pure sound of piano and strings and the wonderful almost feel intrigues me a lot. Especially the part 2 of the first movement. I just wondering, do you have any pictures in your mind to compose this paragraph? Like what kind of the pictures you have in your mind?
Yes, well, for this particular piece, Dawning of the World, it very much relates to where I live right now, which is the Pacific Northwest. And throughout the year, academic year, I of course am there, but in the summers, I'm in New Mexico, living in a high desert. The Pacific Northwest is a temperate rainforest where I live. And it's filled with rivers and mountains and incredible landscapes. So about 30 years ago, I started to develop a concept of creating music that would resemble a landscape. I call them landscape pieces. And so in creating this concerto, inwardly, I had the vision of a landscape that I was realizing in music, so that the form is not a fixed form of any kind, but rather, you might have noticed, there are a number of transformations going on throughout the piece. And sometimes transformations, multiple transformations at the same time in any one movement. And that's just the way that one would experience a landscape. If you were taking a hike through a landscape in a forest, and then you come outside of the forest and you see a beautiful river, and you cross the river and there are mountains just over the hill on the other side of the river. Just as you would have that experience in taking a hike in a landscape, I think you might have a similar experience when you hear this piece, because there's this sense of the morphing or the changing and the transforming of the musics as you go through each of the movements. And of course, it's played in a way that the movements are very connected. They really are very organically conceived in that sense, so that all the material is related on some level, and yet it's also very diverse. And you might also see how that's similar to the experience of a landscape, where things are transforming in nature, but they're transforming in a way where all of those different components and elements that you are experiencing are related organically to each other.
Okay, got you. And the second question, it's about the orchestration. So, I really enjoyed listening to your Join of the World and your piano concerto. Like, how was your experience orchestrating a chamber piece such as Join of the World with piano as the solo instrument, different from orchestrating a large scale work such as your piano concerto? Like, how did your orchestration choices differ, and did you face any challenges while balancing between the piano and the other instruments?
Yes, it was very challenging because, of course, the piano concerto is for solo piano and then quite a large orchestra with an expanded percussion section and harp and celesta. It really was challenging to then create this piece for just a few instruments. Really a kind of expanded Pierrot ensemble. I didn't do it by trying to transfer each of the instruments into the smaller ensemble. What I did was to reimagine the piece so that, in effect, I created it anew. I composed it again, rather than trying to transfer one instrument into the smaller group of instruments. And that made it possible to maintain that sense of the landscape in the piece, because I didn't simply try to imitate the orchestra in a smaller setting. And that was a very exciting process for me, to try to imagine it as a chamber work and something that could be played in a much smaller setting as well. So obviously when the orchestral work is played, it's played in a medium size to a large hall, but the chamber work could be played in a very small space, in a small hall. But how to get a similar effect to the piano and orchestra in a larger context, in a larger space, get that same feeling and that same effect in a smaller setting, that was a challenge, which I enjoyed very much. And what I did, I gave myself a little bit of an assignment to not change the piano part itself, but change only the instruments other than the piano. And so that was kind of my premise. That's where I began from as I reimagined the work. Of course, there are quite a few instruments that are not in the smaller ensemble. No brass instruments and so forth and so on, no percussionist. And so that was a big challenge, is how to make those instruments come alive, but in a very different kind of ensemble.
Okay, so very pleasant to hear that. And the last question for me here is, for the piano concerto, like, it's really wonderful and beautiful. I'm curious about like what inspired you to compose the piece. Also, could you explain the inner emotions in each movement?
Yes, I was inspired by the beauty of where I live in the Pacific Northwest. The piece is really related to my work in the area of the environment and working with the theme of living in harmony with nature. And this has been a theme that has preoccupied me for decades, since I was actually in high school. Because I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is on Lake Erie. And in my junior year in high school, in the summertime in June, a river in Cleveland caught on fire. If you can imagine, the river started to burn because of the pollution that had been put into the river, mostly chemicals and some other inflammable substances. It caught fire and melted most of a bridge. It was a very serious matter at the time. It was the first time this had happened in the United States in this way. And it was, in fact, a huge wake-up call for the whole country. And the result of it was that Congress eventually, because of that, acted and passed a bill for clean water, and there was a Clean Water Act after that. And this whole idea of environmental protection became part of the common understanding of how we needed to deal with the problems of the environment. And at that time, with some friends, we started a little environmental organization, and we approached companies and other organizations that were related to this issue of environmental pollution. And that started me on a lifelong focus on the environment, on nature. How can we coexist with nature in a way that is very positive and harmonious? Live with nature in that way rather than trying to dominate nature, rather than trying to just use it for what we want without actually making a real relationship that will preserve our natural resources and enable us to thrive and live well within this beautiful world that we have. Now, as you can imagine, that was a long time ago. That was in 1969. And here we are in 2021 in a very different world. And we're very close to what's called the tipping point, as you may know, where if we reach a certain point, it may not be possible to recover or to save certain aspects of our environment. We may have gone past the point where we can do that. We're just short of that tipping point at this point in time. And that's very, very concerning to me. So many of my works over the last 2 to 3 decades have worked with this theme in one way or another. And it's also part of an important theme for me, which is conflict and reconciliation. And how can we take a situation, in this case, what's happening to the environment, which is filled with such conflict between people about the nature of what's happening. And how can we deal that in a way that brings about some kind of reconciliation that would then relate to the healing of that situation? And in this case, the healing of the environment. So the piece that I wrote comes out of that commitment that I have to working with the themes that relate to the natural world. And it was written for a very special occasion, which was a year to celebrating the Eugene Symphony Orchestra. And they commissioned 3 new pieces, one from Mason Bates, and one from Roberto Sierra, and one from myself. And they asked me to write the concerto and to put it on a program with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So of course there was no pressure. That was not an easy assignment to be given, to kind of be the opener for Beethoven's Ninth. And so I thought, well, what could I do that could relate to Beethoven's Ninth and to that program and to the celebration of the symphony? And because we live in such a beautiful part of the world, in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, I focused on the environment, and then also this message, because in the Beethoven, you have the Ode to Joy, which is about bringing humanity together, all the people within humankind, finding the connectedness between us and celebrating that and working through this kind of way that would bring about, in effect, a better humankind, with more consideration about each other, more care about who we are and what we need to do in the world. And so I wanted to create a piece that would have that element with it as well. And that spirit is in Dawning of the World. It's about dawn in the sense of the dawn that you experience in nature, but it's also about the dawning of a new consciousness. Just as you've had in the Beethoven, in this piece, it's the dawning of a new consciousness about how we live with nature living in harmony with nature rather than trying to dominate it and trying to subjugate it to our will, but in fact finding a way that we can work with nature so that it can continue to sustain us and so that we won't destroy it. So if you look at the piece and you asked about the different emotional contexts of each of the movements, it's a transformation from the beginning to the end. In the first movement, there's a sense of setting out on the journey and a sense of exploring these really varied landscapes in the form of the music itself, but also in the way that the piece is orchestrated, is very colorful orchestration, and the dialogue between the piano and the orchestra. And then there's a cadenza that connects the first movement to the second one. And the second one is very different. It's really more of a reflection. In this sense, you could say about the beauty of nature and the way that nature sustains us. And then in the third movement, it's really an exploration of a sense of the way that light interacts with nature. There's a sense of the air and the light and going out into an open space and feeling that beautiful quality of being uplifted during a beautiful day as one is taking a journey through various ecosystems. And then finally, in the last movement, it's a celebration of the natural world itself and our relationship to it and our relationship to each other, the way in which we connect to each other through nature itself. So that's the journey of the entire work.
Thank you, Professor.
Sorry, my internet was not stable, so I just.
Sorry about that. That's our new COVID times, right? We're dealing with so much technology at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for your answer.
Thank you so much for the wonderful questions. Really appreciated them. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Kier. So I really enjoyed listening to your answers to those questions. I mean, I think your thoughts and ideas with the kind of relationship with music and something real, I mean, are the reality like right next to us. They're very thought-provoking. By the way, I also really love the landscape, but I just haven't come up with anything like you did, like bring music and our reality together. So I'll start with my questions. I have some questions related to, in particular with your musical language. So to begin with, throughout your piece, Dawning of the World, were you thinking about particular modes and scales? As I noticed some recurring interval patterns and ostinatos throughout the piece.
Well, you're a very good listener, because the piece may, on one level, people have said that it's quite accessible, that you can listen to it from really many different vantage points. So somebody could listen to it as a general listener who maybe that person claims not to have a musical background and they could appreciate it. Or somebody who is maybe more interested in music theory might listen to it and find different relationships and things that they could be interested in. And one of the things that some people have remarked on is how many different kinds of modes and scales there are within the piece. And yet it's very unified from the beginning to the end. So to start by talking about the mode that people find most unusual, because perhaps they haven't heard the kind of music I'm about to talk about, it in the last movement, it's based on a scale from the gamelan. It's called Pelog 5. It's really a mode rather than a scale. In the gamelan that I direct, because I direct the Pacific Rim gamelan, which I have directed since 1991, we have a complete gong kebyar, which is a village-style gamelan. And that particular mode for our gamelan is C sharp, D, E, G sharp, A. And of course, in that mode, you've got a gap between the E and the G sharp. So some people call it a gap tone mode. And then if you go up to the octave, you have another gap between the A and the C sharp. So composing with just 5 notes is a challenge. If you're creating music in the gamelan, which we do because we're a composing performing ensemble, everybody in the gamelan is a composer and a performer. So I teach people how to play the instruments and then how to compose for them. It's a completely new experience as compared to our 12-note style of composition, which is very different. There you have a scale where there is no gap in the scale. There's 1 note on each of the chromatic tones, or if you're thinking about a diatonic scale, 1 note in each of the notes within a major or minor scale. And then there are many other modes that you could create, obviously, in the 12-tone system. But if you listen to my whole piece, you'll see that each of the movements is based on a different sense of scale and a different sense of mode. So that you start in the first movement in a more diatonic way, and by the time you finish the piece, you've explored different kinds of modes that then become a synthesis of all of those different kinds of music. So diatonic and Palog 5, gamelan music, those are united at the end of the work. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, my interest in working with forms that relate to conflict and reconciliation as well, that over the course of the piece, the reconciliation in this piece is between the different scales and modes and co-creating them into a single kind of music at the end of the piece. That's theoretically where the piece is reaching. I say theoretically because you'd have to analyze it very carefully to see exactly how that's happening moment to moment. But for example, when you get to the third movement, it's very different on a first listening to any of the other movements, but you'll find that it's very closely related if you take a look at the different harmonies that are used, the vocabulary of the harmonies, and how those relate to the other movements. But while it is very related, it's also quite different in certain ways because of the way that the third movement is orchestrated. The actual colors that are used, how the various kinds of harmonies are distributed over the course of the spectrum of tones that could be used for any one instrument, how all those things intersect is actually very different from the way any other movement is orchestrated, and yet related through the harmonies. You could say the same thing about the second movement and its relationship to the first movement. But I hope that answers your questions. Otherwise, it would become a rather long explanation, longer than I've just given, but that's the essence of how it works.
Yeah, thank you. Those were very helpful, explanations. I have another question. I also really enjoyed listening to the Cloud of Unknowing. If I'm correct, the piece is like the cloud changing impermanently, but still keeping in the similar nature. I'm wondering that how this impermanence and the similarity balanced.
You are a very good listener, I have to say, because that is at the heart of the piece. As you see, I've taken different texts from different sources, and one of the sources is the Cloud of Unknowing, which was written in the 14th century by a monk. We don't know the name of the person. And it's written in a different form of English from the one that we speak and the way that we write today. So I took it and I made my own, you could say, translation of it. I would say maybe rendering of it. So that's one of the sources. And then there's the texts that are taken from Saint Teresa of Avila, which I set in the original Castellano, which is a form of Spanish, 16th century form in this case. And taking the different texts from the different sources, plus I took some psalm texts in Latin. Of course, they weren't originally written in Latin, but I took the Latin form because I wanted to relate those different languages. And those languages, if you look linguistically, they themselves and their relationship make a kind of cloud. The sense of trying to express different things through the vehicle of different languages that have different abilities to convey different thoughts and feelings and emotions. And for me, that was very important. Somebody might ask me, well, why didn't you just set everything in one language? Why didn't you pick English or Latin or Castellano? Well, the reason is because you can actually express different emotions, different states of being through the different languages, each in their own way. And I wanted to create the relationship between them and between the inner life of those texts. In other words, the inner life is how those texts are related to the essence of what's being said beyond words. And the Cloud of Unknowing is in a sense about that. It's about transcending the limitations on our understanding and on our knowing, in this sense of certain transcendent elements of our existence. How can we come closer to an understanding of those elements of who we are that are transcendent, beyond just, let's say, our physical existence, beyond our emotion, beyond our mind, but that which is the essence of who we are, and that which connects all of us as one human family. And each of those different sources that I drew from, they are in effect exploring that theme, but in very different ways that could only be expressed that particular way through their culture, through their language. And trying to bring those all together into one piece is a way of suggesting that we're all connected to each other as one human family. And that's part of how we understand and transcend the divisions that we experience in life. So for example, if you want to make this a contemporary message, we right now live in a society that's very divided. And I don't think this is any great secret. It's not just American society, it's societies around the world. For some reason, whatever it might be, this set of divisions, very extreme divisions, have manifested now in the 21st century. And the question is, how are we going to bridge these divisions? How are we going to transcend that which is dividing us? Because unless we understand at a very primary level that we're one human family, we're not going to be able to survive. The planet will come apart, which it is now because of the way we're treating it, as I mentioned earlier in the interview. But it's not only that. There are so many other issues right now. Racial and social injustice, hunger, poverty. The list goes on. How are we going to deal with it? Unless we have that primary understanding of being one human family, and unless we act from that consciousness, we won't be able to go forward. The planet will have a terrible reckoning. I don't mean just nature, but the planet as it exists with human life will have a terrible reckoning until we understand that primary connection between all of us. And that's the spirit out of which the Cloud of Unknowing comes, and also the piece to which it's related, because it's a piece that has a partner, as it were. That's Songs of the Soul. Two pieces are very closely related, because Saint Teresa of Avila was the spiritual advisor and superior for Saint John of the Cross, whose text I set in Songs of the Soul. So those two pieces actually are dealing with the same set of issues, but again, in different ways, depending on the sources that I set to music. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, definitely. And by the way, the questions I asked you are not directly from my questions. It's not my questions.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
these are collected from my wonderful peers.
Well, I
So,
want to. I'll take this this moment to thank them for their great questions.
thank you.
Hi, Professor. So this is my time for some questions about the harmonies in your pieces. And firstly, the student says he really enjoyed listening to your violin concerto. And he noticed that the piece explored tonality in ways that he haven't heard in other pieces, which makes sense given the title or something. And above your introductions before about the musical language you used, I've realized something like the Pomelock, if I pronounced that right. So I was wondering if you could expand on how you went about working with tonal ideas while still creating something new and interesting, because the Pomelock is something that is kind of half a bit of years ago, and you're creating something new languages, new harmonies. How can that balance?
So were you saying, I couldn't quite hear, Pelog, the Pelog 5
Yeah.
mode? That's what you meant, right? Pelog 5 mode. Yeah, from the gamelan music. Well, the issue of how it's created, that's a long story. But what I can talk about is why I have done what I've done to bring these different elements together. And as related to my answer to the previous question, the idea of bringing these different ways of creating harmony in music relates very much to the spiritual theme that I just addressed. I mentioned just a moment ago how we're one human family, but this relates very profoundly so to the fact that there's only one music, and the fact that we choose to take music and divide it against itself is a huge problem, so that some people, they listen to a certain number of things. Another person or group of people, another set of things, so forth and so on. So you have many different individuals or groups of people listening to many different musics, and then they start to argue about which music is better and this one and that one and so forth and so on. Well, those are interesting discussions in some way. And why not? Why not talk about it in that way if you would like to and explore it? Some good things could come from that. But at the root of the experience, if one doesn't realize that there's really only one music and people have different responses to it, then we've got a problem, because we're just setting up new modes of conflict with each other. And we're using music to do it, which is not going to help anyone. So let me just share this with you, because I think it gets the point across very directly. It's said that music is the one art that is common to all human experience, every culture, which means that the very first human being that ever lived, we are now related to that person, that being, through music. Music's the great connector. It's the bridge between all human beings, because it's a common experience for all of us. And so finding ways to work with music that would share that and express that and help us to make greater connections across what we perceive as divisions in society music has the capability to help us heal so much of what we're experiencing right now. And you see it in many ways. I could spend the next hour talking about it, but I'll just give one example that during the difficulties, and more than that, the horrors of the pandemic, you'll notice that people have used music as a way of trying to reach people and heal people across boundaries within society, bring people together. It really has been serving that function, and that's been pointed out. Now, of course, you have pop music that's been used that way, but you have many other forms of music as well. And I would say that that's been a very important part of the healing process. I think of the people in Italy who, when Italy was first shut down during the pandemic, going out onto their balconies because they couldn't connect with each other. They live in a culture where personal connection is so important, to be able to hug each other and kiss each other and be close with each other. That's Italian culture is so much based on that in a very direct way. So they went out on their balconies and they sang to each other so that they could connect across these divisions that were physically imposed through the pandemic. And that's one example, just one example of how music connects all of us in a way that is primary. The people help them to heal, to get through these difficult times. And that was true in other cultures as well, of course, around the world. So for me, that's really the essence of what we're talking about. And that's where what we do, if we're doing it in a really good spirit, the spirit of bringing people together, no matter what the style of the music is, it's where it's coming from within us that matters, and how we work with that to bring people together in new ways. And each person will have their own way of doing that. There's no one way that everybody has to do or else. It's something that is a very personal choice. And as I mentioned before, it comes out of a change of consciousness and awareness. What I was saying before about the dawning of the world, that piece, the dawning of a new consciousness that people act out of. So this awareness leading to new action, and in this case, new action through music, and then even beyond music, because music could inspire people to other forms of action. I hope that answers your question in some way. Otherwise, it would be a very long answer.
Yeah, that would be really great. It's like music is the language, and it depends on whether you use it as accuse others or use it to heal others.
Yeah.
So the next question is, the person said, I love the heavenly harmonies in your Songs of the Soul. There are moments that sounded very directly inspired by the Renaissance music even. So whereas others sounded more cluster or pentatonic, how did you go? Because it is voice music, a little bit different from other chamber or instrumental music. Are there any specific things about how did you go about alternating between an older and new age sound, all while keeping a sense of harmonic consistency in the voice music?
Yes, thank you for the question. Again, that's a long answer, but I'll try to be concise about it. In my life, Renaissance and medieval music and Baroque music, all of them have played a big role in shaping who I am as a composer. Because when I went to college as an undergraduate, my first experiences in music beyond the high school years, it was all rooted in medieval and Renaissance and Baroque music, especially Bach. So that was my foundation. Before I arrived at college, I was pretty much a self-taught composer. I'd taken one theory course in the summer, but I'd been composing since I was 10 years old. So arriving at college at 18, I'd already composed a piano concerto and some other pieces. But really in a particular way, my studies, serious studies, began when I arrived at college. And that was very common in those days. This was back in 1970, would have been the year that I entered undergraduate year. So I didn't know this music. I knew Bach, but it was a very different world in terms of our access to music in those days. And we didn't have that much access to medieval and Renaissance music. But I studied with two of the very greatest scholars in a program called Early Concentration Music at Yale University, with Kerala Snyder, who taught at Eastman, and an incredible scholar in the area of Baroque music. Her work was focused on Buxtehude, still is, and other composers as well of that period. And Alejandro Planchart, who was focused in medieval era, and particularly the work of Dufay. He's written I would say, the primary work on the life of Dufay at this point. Before he passed away recently, that book was published, which was an incredible achievement. A lifetime of work went into that book. But their knowledge, their enthusiasm about that music, in a sense, it not only inspired me, but it's as though they turned on all the lights in the house of my musical awareness. All of a sudden, I became a different person. Music became universal and no longer focused within just a few composers who, in those days, it was easy to find records of their music and so forth and so on. But they expanded my consciousness and my worldview of music at that time. And that's the kind of spirit that you experience in Songs of the Soul in particular. It's a very important thread within that work. Another thread is the fact that that work came out of a festival that I was asked to co-create with Craig Hella Johnson. It's an incredible choral visionary director of Concerto, Company of Voices, one of the great choruses in our country. It's in Austin, Texas, and it's an amazing, amazing chorus. I have been so grateful, continue to be so grateful to collaborate with Craig and with every one of his singers. It's not just an honor, it's, again, it was life transforming for me. We've had many projects and are in the midst of doing a new project right now related to the environment, a piece called Earth Ritual, which will be my second environmental oratorio. So Craig invited me to co-create a festival, Renaissance in Response. And each of the concerts was centered around one composer from the Renaissance and then Baroque periods. So I got to choose two and he got to choose two. And I chose Josquin des Prés, and he chose Lassus, Orlando Lassus. And then he chose Victoria, and I chose Bach. And that made the four composers. And so he said, well, I want you to write a response to each one. Well, talk about heavenly music. I was in heaven when he said that. So I created a response to each one of those composers. But when we got to Bach, the fourth concert in the series, my idea was to create a cantata in the manner of Bach, the way that Bach in a cantata would sometimes bring different pieces of music he had actually composed before or imagined before together to create this, what we see as a piece, but actually the movements of what we call a cantata were inside of a service, a religious service in the Lutheran church. So they were sung and performed, played in different parts of the service. And then we later put them together and perform them as a single piece. Well, that's like the process of what I did in some way to create this cantata. I took pieces that I'd created and for these different concerts and drew them together as the choral pillars, the 4 choral pillars. And then in between them, I put movements that were for 2 soloists, soprano and baritone. And that's the setting, those 3 movements, of one text in St. John of the Cross, Noche Oscura, dark night. So we have the expression of dark night of the soul. And it's related to those particular stanzas, 8 stanzas of that poem, which is one of the foundational texts of Western civilization. It's an incredible text, many, many layers of meaning, so much to reflect and about, and also to contemplate. So that created this cantata. And getting back to your question and the idea of how does one take so many different possibilities and influences and ways of creating harmony and put it in a single piece. Well, in reading all of those texts that I chose to set, and by the way, the texts that I chose to set for the choral works were taken from the commentary of St. John on his poem. So the texts are completely organically related. And what I discovered is that inside of those texts, there was not only that relationship, but great diversity of the way that they related to each other. The text that he referred to, that he said gave rise to the music that he created, to the poem that he created. And so what I wanted to do with that was to work with it musically in the way that the texts themselves were interrelated and brought together in the commentary about Noche Oscura, dark night. In that way, the process of creating the texts and the music are one thing. And I call that text for music when I write a text that way. In this case, it's a composite text that I created from these sources, but I conceive the music and the text together as a single entity that you can't pull them apart. And what I've just said is a metaphor for how I've worked with the actual tones of the music, how I've worked with every mode, how I've worked with every scale, every melody, every harmony. They're all connected so that you can't pull them apart. It's as if one were saying that the modal music of medieval Renaissance and then diatonic music of the Baroque period, and as we go forward, chromatic music, and then we have fields of harmony in which there's a collection of tones, but we don't exactly have a name for that field of harmony that's created. It's specific to a certain expression, that all those things can coexist because internally they're connected. They're not separate from each other. And that's what's at the heart of Songs of the Soul. It's really focused on the theme of the unity of all expressions within this field of inquiry. In this case, it's a contemplation, ultimately about love. The piece finishes with the beautiful text from Corinthians, which is love is patient, love is kind, and it expands then that text in considering love from many different angles. And that last movement brings all of the different kinds of harmony that have existed in the piece up to that point, and again makes a synthesis of them. So that when you hear at the end, the fugue, which is created of subjects that are triadic, so that by the time the different chords have sounded against each other. So each subject is made of triads. You get a field of harmonies that you couldn't predict just by listening to the subject itself. It creates a new kind of harmonic field. And the way that it's orchestrated brings out the overtone series. So when you were talking, I think you used the term heavenly music, something like that. It's because of the way the music is illuminated through the orchestration of it using the overtone series. So that even if you look at the score, you'll see there are a lot of notes sounding, but it doesn't sound that thick or that dense because of the way the overtones illuminate the music and the harmonies that unfold. And that's where the piece is going, toward that sense of illumination. That's where it's being directed. Even though it starts in a very dark place, it goes from despair to transcendence in the end. And it's a journey of transformation from the beginning to the end of the piece, working with those principles of harmony that I just talked about and that you were asking about. Well, I hope that answers your question.
That's greatly. It already has a profound influence on how I should compose and how I should understand the music. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll have time just to put one final question here. Fortunately, you answered most of the questions we didn't get to, so this has been a pretty great interview. The one thing I wanted to touch on, in one of your interviews, I believe the Composer of the Month one, you briefly touched on being a filmmaker as well as a composer. Could you just talk about some of that and what you've done and how it's related to your music?
Thanks so much for asking about that. I just finished making an hour-long film on the oratorio, A Time for Life. That's my first environmental oratorio, which was commissioned by Capella Romana, incredible chorus with Alexander Lingus as the director. Incredible chorus in Portland that does programs in Portland, Seattle. Every program is in 2 cities, and now also in San Francisco, many of them, 3 cities. So it's a regional chorus in that sense. And we created that work together, co-created it, related to themes of the environment. And at that time, I committed to creating an environmental oratorio every 10 years. And now, given what's happening in the environment, it's now every 5 to 7 years because things have speeded up. So I'm writing the second one now. That's the piece I referred to earlier, Earth Ritual. But the first one, A Time for Life, I was recently, during the pandemic, commissioned to create a film. So usually, of course, when you are writing music for film, you're literally doing that. You're given a film and you write music for the film. This is the reverse process. I was given the music that I created, that was a concert piece. It's an oratorio. It's an organic piece of music in which all the themes and harmonies are very carefully related, the very organic form of composition. And in many ways, it's very concise. Every moment is filled with a lot of content and substance. And inside of that, the inner life of it, the themes are interrelated. And in terms of the music, the musical themes and harmonies are so interrelated. Well, now I was given the task of creating film to music. And that's a very different process and extremely different when we're talking about creating a film to an oratorio that's very organic, where everything is interrelated. So added to that, I was asked to create the photography and the video, because I'm also a photographer and videographer for the piece. So 2/3 of it is my own visual content that I created, taking trips over the summer, this past summer, throughout Oregon, which has 16 of the 18 ecosystems on the earth. It's the only things we don't have are tropical forest and tundra. And I went to some very extreme places because I love exploring wilderness. And I brought that photography, videography, and also invited a photographer who I think is an incredible artist, Hunter Madsen is his name, to provide roughly 1/3 of the piece, the internal section, part 2 of it, but parts 1 and 3 are almost exclusively my photography and videography. Well, when you put that all together, and then working with a video editor and working so closely together, that's a very involved process. And that's the kind of filmmaking that I love, that kind of co-creation with different individuals and also myself providing different aspects of the whole work of art. So quite frankly, I was in seventh heaven the whole time. From the time they asked me to do it, it was my dream to be able to do something like that. And I started making film back in, would have been 1973, 74, but the technology was so clunky. It just didn't work for me. So I stopped. And then I studied, did film studies when I went to University of Pennsylvania for my master's and studied with George Crumb and George Rockberg, but we could also cross-register in the Annenberg School of Communications. And I did that and studied film, but wasn't making film. Again, the technology didn't work. So fast forward, when we developed HD, high definition video, that's when finally I could realize the vision that I had had for so long. And fortunately, this particular piece, A Time for Life, provided all of the themes and all of the concerns, human concerns, that I'm so involved with, in this case, focused around the environment. So I could bring all of that together. And that's what I try to do in film. The kinds of films that I've made have largely been for public performance, concert performance. So a film would be a component of a larger work that would be perhaps an orchestral work like my 11th Symphony, Yosemite Journey of Light, where I collaborated with Larry Jan's incredible photographer, who's was a protege of Ansel Adams, the great nature photographer. And he provided the nature photography for that with still photography, incredible work that he did, and I created the music. So again, music to visual images. But this was the reverse, creating music, creating visual images to music in a very involved process. We must have spent, I think, probably at least 1,000 hours on the project. I don't think anything less than that. But what I'll do is, because we just had the launch, I will actually send you a link to the film so that if you and all of your fellow students would like to look at it, feel free to distribute it. And you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Probably that's the best way to answer how I make film and what I love doing in that medium. And I think you'll see that it relates to some of the themes I've talked about today. The theme of being a landscape piece, having a journey that's part of the actual form of the piece and how it unfolds. So I'll share that with you. I'll send you the link very shortly.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I think we have to wrap up now. I don't know if Professor Liptap will enter back into the call. But if not, I think we can, oh, there we go. I think we'll end the meeting soon.
Thank you. I have been listening, and I think this has been really wonderful. Thank you, Rob, for being with us, and to the team especially for doing such a wonderful job with the questions of your peers and yourselves. I shall now stop the recording, and then we can have just a few minutes of private conversation afterwards. So thank you.
May I just say thank you to everybody? I just would, before you stop it, I would like to just say thank you to to you, David, and to your colleagues for creating such a wonderful context for an interview, to invite us to submit our works, everybody who's been interviewed, and to do it in the way that you did it is really very inspiring for the people who are being interviewed. It's just thank you for such a wonderful structure. And then the way that you've interwoven that with your curriculum and pedagogy is so great. Really, it's suggested some new ways that we could do things here within our own program. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you, Bob. Okay, so goodbye for now.